All right, I'm going to get us started. So my name is Emily Grossman, and I direct the CBC Training Institute. And I am here today with Michael Blady and Patti Abelson, and they are going to do a wonderful presentation for us on professional boundaries for pandemic times and beyond. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping things that I have to do. First of all, I want to read a little bit about Zoom and how it's going to work for today's webinar. So all participants were automatically placed on mute when you joined the webinar in order to avoid distracting background noises during today's presentation. You cannot unmute yourself, but if you would like to ask a question, please write it in the chat box and remember to chat to everyone. Patti is going to be reading things out of the chat box, and so we are going to make sure we acknowledge as many of your comments and questions as possible. You should see the chat icon on the bottom of the screen, but if you don't see it, look in kind of the middle of the bottom and click where there's a speech bubble, and the chat box should pop up on the right. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties or issues with your connection during today's webinar, we have Tara here today. And Tara from the McSilver Institute is going to be the one that you chat to. You're going to chat to host, and Tara will assist you with your technological difficulties. Thank you, Tara. So I just want to give you a brief synopsis or overview about CBC and SAMHSA and a few other things. So first of all, you should all know that this webinar is totally free to you because of a grant that we received from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration to provide self-care training to mental health professionals. This is a series of trainings, and we hope that you'll join us for others. If you want to be added to our mailing list, if you were not yet, I will in a moment put my email address into the chat box, but it's egrossman@cbcare.org. So I'll momentarily add that to the chat box. And we can go to the next slide. I want to tell you a little bit about coordinated behavioral care. CBC is a not-for-profit dedicated to improving the quality of care for New Yorkers with serious mental illness, chronic health conditions, and/or substance use disorders through a health home, an independent practice association, and other innovative programs such as preventative case management services. You may have heard of Pathway Home, which is a program where we provide very good care to people that are coming out of state hospitals. We also have a few teams for people that are homeless and are living in the MTA subway system, or so that's part of what we do. We also really support our independent practice association of 50 member agencies with training, and we do a lot involving billing for them, and we also do a lot involving quality improvement. So CBC wears many, many hats. But what you should know for today is that CBC has partnered with the Bridge and SAMHSA in order to bring you this very, very important training today. So I want to go to the next slide, and we're going to talk a little bit about this training institute. So CBC has our own training institute, and you can see that we provide a wide array of different trainings. There's our mission statement on the top, and then below you can see some of the trainings we've done in the last 6 months. Everything from treating seasonal affective disorder to an anti-racism training, and so many different ones in between. And we are now bringing you all of these wonderful self-care SAMHSA trainings. So with that, I really want to turn it over to Patti Abelson, who is going to introduce the topic and talk to you a little bit about today's presentation. We're so lucky to have both Patti and Michael here today. So Patti, take it away.
Emily, thank you so much. It's an honor and a privilege to be here today with all of you. My name is Patti Abelson. I'm AVP of Training and Quality Initiatives at the Bridge. And as I always say when I begin a training with our staff at the Bridge, Our staff has the awesome responsibility of helping and supporting our consumers, our clients. My responsibility is to support our staff. And Emily, I thank you and CBC so much for extending the notion of what our community is. While my job is to support folks at the bridge, we're now connecting with people who have those same responsibilities, but through this wide network that CBC has created. And the idea of bringing us all together and recognizing how much we all have in common and how much we can help each other is, to me, essential form of self-care, because knowing that you are not alone is everything. And you guys are not alone. We are here for you. And I hope you feel that support during the course of this conversation today. Please make liberal use of the chat box. One of the features of life today is Zoom. It makes it harder to look somebody in person in the eye. We don't even have your faces here, so to look at and smile at. And one of the ways that we can make those connections is because you talk to us through chat. So please do that. Boundaries. I went to social work school quite a long time ago, and even then we talked about boundaries. While they were very different because the world has changed so much, the role of a professional and other helpers in the lives of clients has really changed. We used to be really standoffish, right? We're not so offish anymore. And you know what? It makes things harder. It makes things harder because where do you draw the line in your relationships with your clients, where you want to be a real human being, but you also want to make sure that you're clear about the work that has to happen? Boy, is that ever complicated. So I will now turn it over to Michael Blady, my friend and colleague, the former COO of the bridge, who is now an independent consultant. And we're delighted that we can maintain our relationship with him. So Michael, thank you so much. And you're on.
Thank you, Patti. And I'm really glad to be here. I think Patti gave a great introduction and I think really set the table for what we're going to try to do today. So the first thing I would like to do with everybody, because one of the real challenges, especially doing trainings during Zoom and so on, is that it's very hard for us to kind of be present in one place. If we're in a training room and so on, sometimes people are looking at their phone and so on, but usually they're kind of there. We're all pushed to multitask and to kind of have our head in multiple places. So again, it's kind of, I think, a self-care thing is to try for a little while not to multitask, to try to be present in the moment, to have as full of an experience as you can have right now. So to get started, I'd just like everybody to kind of get comfortable, sit upright, with your back straight in your chair, not tight, not rigid, but just kind of upright. It's just there's a little bit of a string kind of pulling, your spine and head up, just gently, and to close your eyes just for a few moments and feel kind of your whole body here. And very often it's really helpful to get grounded by feeling your bottom kind of on your seat in your chair, your legs flat on the ground, and to really feel from your feet all the way up to your head. And then to take 3 deep breaths. If you can, try making your inhales and exhales the same count, whether it's kind of 3, 3, 4, 5, it doesn't matter. Okay. Now, gently, when you're ready, open your eyes, and we'll begin. So, the training today is on professional boundaries. And as you can see here, we're going to try to define what we mean by boundaries. We're going to try to kind of talk about why they're important, because sometimes it's not totally self-evident. We're going to learn about a difference between violating boundaries and sometimes crossing them for therapeutic reasons. We're going to learn how to avoid errors and make good decisions, but we certainly are going to make errors. We're going to talk a little bit about telehealth because that's kind of a lot of where our world is right now. And we're going to talk about the importance of self-care. You know, Patti mentioned the chat box and are encouraging people to be active in the chat box. I want to reinforce that because this presentation at its heart is about having a nuanced understanding of our relationships with clients and how that supports their recovery, their mental health, and our well-being. And getting to that understanding is really an interactive process because neither Patti or I have all the answers here. We're going to talk about, some of the clear boundaries, but not everything is really clear. So, Tara, we have our first chat box. I mean, not chat box, but poll question, because we'd like to get an idea of who's on the call today. And if those of you who are saying other, why don't you type it in the chat box for us, what you do.
Oh, Michael, what an amazing, wonderful range of folks we have here today.
Yeah, so we're yeah. Is anybody typed into the chat?
Oh my goodness, and how we have program directors, social work supervisors, peers, clubhouse staff generalists, physicians. It's really moving, to see the numbers who have gathered together to learn together about these things. So
That's great. So we're going to kind of make sure that we have kind of a big tent approach to this presentation today because we have people, who are really playing, and we're going to talk a little bit about how context and role often plays an important role in the developing of boundaries. See, I'm not advancing here. There we go. So the first thing I want to say is boundaries are not brick walls. Get that back. Okay. Boundaries are not brick walls. They, there's certain things that really are kind of with clear, specific ethical guidelines, professional values, and so on that govern our interactions. Some of us who are, you know, if you're a social worker or an LMHC and so on, you're a psychiatrist or a doctor, you know, you have your organizational missions, values, and so on. But there are a lot of situations where the boundaries are not so clear. So we are not going to be able to provide a cookbook here. And again, that's why it's important for us to be able to have some interaction and to get your questions about it. We're going to spend most of this presentation in the gray areas, where there are not always hard and fast rules, and where the boundaries can be influenced by role, context, cultural considerations, diagnosis, history. And this other thing I want to talk about and just kind of really think is Patti and I will be expressing some things about boundaries and how we see it and so on. Your agency may have guidelines that differ than some of the things we say, and that's entirely possible. So the disclaimer here is you have to follow your agency guidelines. Now, you know, if something comes up in this presentation that you want to bring back to your supervisor, directors, and so on, and say, hey, we should think about this in another way, that would be great. But I don't want anybody kind of, you know, going back to their agencies and saying, well, I did this because they told me on a presentation, even though our policy and procedure said something different. The other thing I want to say in terms of one size does not fit all, that each role, and it's one of the reasons we wanted to ask about what you do. The boundaries can be really different in terms of, you know, in these gray areas. You know, from a therapist where you're seeing somebody for 45 minutes or 30 minutes once a week. If you're a prose staff person and you're seeing people in groups and in the hallways, that can be different than if you're a residential counselor and somebody is, you know, you're working where someone lives, or you're a care coordinator or an ACT staff member where you're going into people's homes and other contexts. The role issues and the, you know, can really create different boundaries issues. Getting a delay here on my side. Okay, so first thing I want to say is boundaries are relational. So Patti, I'm going to ask people to put in the chat box what word or phrase comes to mind when they think about the word boundaries.
I have my eye out.
Okay.
Structure. Respect, separation, self-respect. Wow, professionalism and self-care. Separation. Wow, this is so wonderful. Limits. I agree with respect and borders you do not cross. Use of appropriate language. Personal space. Dion, yeah. And we come back again to self-care.
Okay, great.
And may I add one, because Nicole has just added something that is so worth sharing. Being firm yet caring.
Great. Thank you, Nicole. Okay. So boundaries exist in every relationship. There are boundaries in marriage. There are boundaries between parents and children, between a worker and a supervisor, between coworkers, between strangers, right? All of these, they're boundaries, you know, are how we establish physical and emotional limits. They relate to how, you know, what's acceptable. in the relationship, how to talk with each other, how we talk, how we interact, how we behave. They're often dependent on culture and family history. And it's how we protect our privacy and establish our individuality. Now, a professional boundary is an interpersonal dividing line that creates a physically and emotionally safe environment for clients, right? It distinguishes the relationship we have with our clients from the other ones we had on that other slide, and the other ones that are in our lives. And this is really the key factor. When we work with people, whether we, I think it's different, and I know there are some peers on the call, and the relationship is often different, but largely the relationships we have with our clients are not equal relationships. We are often in an authority relationship with the client. And the most important thing is that a professional boundary, its main purpose is to benefit the client. Most of our other boundary relationships are in more equal relationships, maybe not so much with kids, but these are equal relationships. And with boundaries, the primary beneficiary of that boundary is the client. And here are some of the components of the boundaries. As you can see, we have internal and external limits. We have our values. And this is the next one is really, we're going to talk about it, and that is safety. And one of the critical components of setting professional boundaries is to establish a safe relationship for the client and for ourselves. It provides clarity. We're going to talk more about safety because one of the truisms is that nobody gets better, nobody recovers. No one's mental health improves if they don't feel at the base level that they're safe. Boundaries help us establish clarity about our role between us and the client, but also our role vis-a-vis other care providers. A lot of our clients have multiple care providers, and the boundaries, there are boundaries between us and our professional roles. There are also boundaries in terms of our responsibilities with clients, about negotiating what they are going to do in the relationship and what we are going to do. So, why are boundaries important? And you can see here, these are some of the factors. The one I want to focus on really primarily here is the issue of trauma. You probably know from other presentations you've been on, and just from your own personal experience and working with clients and seeing psychosocials and so on, the great majority, I think conservatively 75, 80% of the clients we work with have at one time been subject to trauma, whether it's childhood trauma, neglect and abuse, or trauma as an adult, and so on. We work with a population that has a terrible experience with trauma. And trauma, especially childhood trauma, just by definition, is often an authority person blurring the boundaries between themselves and a child, themselves and a person. It's kind of baked into a boundary issue. A parent, an uncle, a family member having sex with the child, abuse, neglect, and so on, not caring for the child because in a parental relationship, again, the child is supposed to be paramount. where those kinds of boundaries get blurred, we have, people who have trauma. And one of the things we really want to try to do is avoid re-traumatizing people, avoid creating boundaries that elicit a trauma response in people. That's the way we maintain a therapeutic environment. It's a way it provides a corrective experience to people, that they can be in a relationship with an authority figure where their needs are being primarily honored. The other thing is that it does create a safe environment, but not only for the staff, for the client, but for the staff member, who, if we're not eliciting a trauma response, which, in the kind of example of a fight, flight, freeze response, there are safety issues that can come up. And the other thing that we have here is that clear boundaries promote job satisfaction and safety for everybody. It's one of the ways, if we have good boundaries, that we kind of have self-care and prevent burnout.
Michael,
Yeah.
you know what I would love to add here right now?
Yeah.
Is thank you so much. It is something that I think I've come to believe is so important in terms of self-care. And it doesn't, it's a component of self-care that doesn't have to do with things that you do for your own health, however important those things are, but have to do with how you feel when you leave work at the end of the day. And if you're really able to have articulate for yourself, not, you take into consideration your job description, you take into consideration, sort of the tasks you're required to accomplish every day. But I invite each of you to think and share, if you like, how you would put your own personal purpose for your work into words. Because if you walk through the door in the morning and think, here's why I am here, here's why my presence matters, and here are the things I'm going to do today, which are within the bounds of what I have to do to fulfill that purpose, so that when I leave, I can say, yes, I accomplished something. And what we want you to know is that if you can find, if you're aware, sort of in the way Michael invited us to pay attention, if you pay attention and you notice 10 minutes during the course of the day where you feel, yes, I was in the zone, I got it done, celebrate that. And we are learning more and more that sense of satisfaction with your effort is a source of insulation against burnout. So, when we think about boundaries, we think about purpose, why you are here today, and pay attention to what you're doing, so that you think, is this consistent with that purpose of mine? And I myself find that incredibly helpful, and I just wanted to share that with you guys.
Great, thanks, Patti. I don't know if there's any chat in there that in response and so on that you wanted to take a look at before we move on.
People are, Romaine has said that, clear boundaries are part of job satisfaction. It helps you know who you are and what you're supposed to do. And Ebony liked this idea of, here's why I am here today. Thank you both.
Mm-hmm. Great. So when we step beyond boundaries, there are really kind of two categories. One are boundary violations, and the other are boundary extensions and crossings. I know kind of technical language and so on, but it's important to kind of have them, because they distinguish between what's appropriate, kind of where, we said there are no brick walls here. Well, the boundary violations are kind of brick walls. And the boundary extensions and crossings are where we get into the gray areas. So boundary violation, read this. It's a crossing of a personal or professional boundary that's not in the service of the client. It's harmful, and it violates ethics, regulations, guidelines of the law. It's often, but not always, unwelcome and perceived as by the client as harmful. Now, there are times when a client might welcome an unprofessional interaction with staff, even if it's harmful and it undermines their treatment. Can anybody, again, put in the chat times where maybe you've known of a situation at work where there was a boundary violation that was really clear, but the client didn't seem to be particularly concerned about it, that they didn't find it unwelcome?
People are thinking.
Yeah. Well, maybe we're lucky that nobody's ever had to deal with a situation. Okay. I raise that because all of us have what we refer to as maladaptive behaviors. There are, when someone has been traumatized and abused and so on, sometimes they continue that behavior into their lives and into adulthood, and they try to elicit a similar relationship as they get older. And it's the staff person's responsibility to maintain the boundary. And we're going to talk a little bit later about when clients might actually try to elicit a boundary violation. But the important thing is that it's always the staff's responsibility to maintain the boundary. So what are some examples of boundary violations? Patty, we have a few things in the chat. Is there anything we should take a look at before we move on?
Let's see. Well, people are saying that a client eventually shared that her therapist had sexually molested her.
Mm-hmm.
Can you imagine that? But for a long time, she felt he was helping her with her insecurities.
Right.
If that isn't an amazing example of, the very thing you asked about, Michael, I don't know what could be.
Right.
And then will client
That's all
persist.
too often.
Yeah. Well, also that what that tells you is that, we always have to be so, demand the best of ourselves, because we have to teach our clients about what appropriate boundaries are like, right? Because,
right.
The idea that sexual molestation is acceptable is a lesson from the past. And that, Emily talks about parenting, changing that is very much part of the work we do.
Yep. So what are some of the examples? What Patty just talked about, sexual and romantic. That's a clear violation, but I did want to come as a caveat. is that the Justice Center does provide an exemption for staff who are also recipients of services. So there are times, again, when we talk about roles and so on, that there are times when, you know, in peer situations and so on, you have to be really careful, and it can still be abusive and so on. But there is an exemption in the Justice Center rules.
Michael, you know, somebody is now sharing that they had the experience was of a client calling again and again and again, Marjorie tells us, and that the other staff said to her, listen, why are you not responding to those phone calls, Marjorie? You know, what's up with that? You need to get back to her. And, you know, to me, that's a really great example of why it's important that establishing boundaries be a team sport. Yep. That everyone needs to be on the same page in your, because again, you know, people watch us and learn, and how we establish boundaries is so important. And if we're not consistent, it's confusing as can be to clients. Mm-hmm. So, you know, the coherence and consistency in the team is so, it matters so much. And, you know, bringing this back to your team and having a conversation about it, and where you guys set boundaries together, you know, and sometimes you have to talk it out and figure it out together. But it's such a valuable thing to do, so that you don't have to deal with the kind of stress that Marjorie did when people didn't understand what she was trying to achieve.
Another one is substance use. Don't get high with your clients. And, you know, there have been situations where clients have, you know, have reported that. I mean, I think Patti and I are, you know, kind of will both, you know, kind of draw upon our experiences, you know, of a long time working in programs where there, you know, have unfortunately been boundary violations. It kind of seems self-evident, but these things, you know, kind of do happen. Financial, lending and borrowing money with a client. Taking money from a client for services that's part of the staff's job. Hiring a client to do personal work. You know, these are all things I, you know, have to say that in my career I have encountered. You know, especially around the financial, if you're helping people with money management and so on, there have unfortunately been situations where staff had, for whatever, you know, personal reason, and might have even been, you know, kind of desperate circumstances for themselves, violated a client's rights. These are just really difficult situations, but again, we have to put the client first.
Yeah.
Confidentiality. It's important to think of confidentiality as a boundary violation. We can't obviously be sharing information with people.
You know, Michael, we want to thank Tara, who is helping us manage this session today, for raising a really critical issue, which is how about boundaries in terms of supervision? What are the kinds of things that belong in a conversation with your supervisor, which is a way to think about boundaries. And, you know, when, you know, boundaries are a moving target, things change all the time. And one of the reasons I think issues in supervision have become so challenging in terms of establishing boundaries has to do with two things, Tara, I would say. One is COVID, right? Boundaries are changing so much in COVID. We're asking each other much more about our personal lives. And while you may never have talked to your supervisor about the demands on you from kids, now maybe you have to, because they're home with you. You know, so that's something that's shifting. What's going to happen later on, we'll see. Then there's also, you know, the whole idea of secondary trauma sharing with a supervisor the impact of absorbing a client's pain and what that happens and what that's like for you, because perhaps of it resonates because of your own pain in your life. Those are things that need to be established. Just like we have a contract with clients, you have a contract with a supervisor, you shouldn't have to guess about what it's all right to discuss with your supervisor and where the boundaries are. It needs to be overt, or else it becomes a horrible source of anxiety and a lack of clarity. But that's such an important issue. Yeah, right. So, somebody is saying here also that a client had given staff access to an EBT card, which is about a clear boundaries violation as there could be. And that gets to the issue of how do you handle it when you know a colleague has crossed a boundary, right?
So now we're going to talk about, again, get into the gray area of boundary extensions and crossings. So boundary extension is a thoughtful and purposeful crossing of a boundary in keeping with the client goals, and there's no violation of professional ethics and laws. Most of the time, a client does not experience the crossing as abusive or unwelcome or harmful. And we are going to talk about experiences where sometimes the client does perceive the boundary extension as unwelcome in their lives. And it often comes up when there's a conflict between a professional obligation and what the client, what's going on with the client. And I just want to put in a caution. Just because we believe that a boundary extension is intended to be helpful, sometimes the client doesn't perceive it that way. And what we're going to talk about now are dual relationships. And I'm going to ask people to kind of put into the chat box, when they hear the term dual relationship, or they think about a boundary extension or one of these, what do you think is included in that? What is a dual relationship, or what is an acceptable boundary violation? Not violation, sorry. I'm using the word wrong. Extension or crossing.
Michael, maybe you can share some of the ideas that you have about, sort of examples of dual relationships.
Okay, so these are relationships with clients outside the work environment. So very often they happen when a worker lives in the same community as the client. New York City, it's so big, this does come up. But I know when I've traveled to other areas, and I think there may be some people from upstate who are on the call and so on, very often if you're living in a smaller community, your client could be a cashier in the supermarket.
Right.
You client might be at the same PTA meeting you're at. I know when I had a private practice, the surprise I got one day while in my shorts and t-shirt, when a client of mine got on the bicycle next to me. There was an unintended dual relationship. We were both members of the same gym.
Right. Well, that
it can happen.
Yeah. That it goes exactly in line with what Gretchen shared. which is, dual relationship is having, on the one hand, a professional relationship with a client, and then perhaps sort of a friend, either a friendship or just being sort of a neighbor, being friends on Facebook.
Right.
Doris realized that one of her client's daughters went to the same dance class as Doris's daughter. That's exactly, I think, what we mean when we talk about dual relationships, isn't it, Michael?
Yeah. It might be if you're in recovery and you go into a 12-step group and a client is there, and kind of what you're going to do about that. It often happens if you're working in a residential environment, where you're working in a place where somebody lives. And again, I will share the tendency for the boundaries to blur. When I was the director of a large residential program, it was not uncommon practice for staff to give clients money and say, go get me a cup of coffee and buy one for yourself. And when I questioned that as kind of a boundary issue and so on, the staff, at first would kind of say, well, they're getting a cup of coffee for themselves. I'm doing a nice thing. They don't have much money. This is really a thing. And we had to have a real honest conversation about how doing that changed the relationship with the person. And Patti mentioned, social media networking. We're going to talk, about that. I mentioned earlier that sometimes when we do extend the boundary, clients might feel it is unwelcome. And I'll tell you that, again, in my career, the first time I had to face that is when I was working in a day treatment program. And I learned about a situation where I had to make a child abuse call on one of my clients. There was a strong suspicion that they were physically abusing their child. And I needed to talk with the client in an open and honest way about my need to make that report, even though they did not want me to, and it was unwelcome, and they were going to have social services, and they might potentially have their child placed, and so on. I needed to, kind of say, I'm mandated. This is, in this case, I have a requirement to do that. The same in the more minor ways, if you're a residential counselor and in your agency, residential counselors are involved in rent collection. And you might be talking with a client about, they're not paying their rent and the possibility of they're getting evicted and so on. Collecting rent is, in a sense, it's a different relationship than the case management relationship. And it needs to be managed, and it needs to be managed in an open and transparent way. So I don't know, again, I'd ask people if they wanted to put into the chat any experiences they've had with any of these situations.
I'm going to apologize if I mispronounce your name, but I'm grateful to you, Falguni, I hope that's correct, for sharing, sort of extending the conversation by what you share. I met with a person receiving our services, but I didn't communicate with them. I did, though, tell my coworker. And you're adding something that is so important here, which is the fact that these things are really good. Things that are confusing are going to happen. Thank you. Things that are confusing are going to happen. And you don't want to keep it to yourself if you feel as if there might have been an issue. you don't want that other client that you saw then to say, oh boy, I was at this group with, Falguni and, remember, our clients, it's sad and we wish it weren't so, but our clients can look at us as if we're movie stars. They think they should only know that we have life licked and you are who they want to be. So they watch you so carefully to see, to learn, role models. And, so you can be sure that whatever they see you do outside the context of your professional role, I can promise you that that client told everybody they could, how fast Mike, I took a picture of Michael in his shorts and his shirt on the bicycle and shared it with all the other clients if they were in a residence, right? So, you want to be the one to give the information about a potential boundary crossing to a supervisor or to the other client's caseworker or care manager. It's just a tip.
Okay. So what are some examples of boundary extensions? There's self-disclosure, accepting a gift, going to a life cycle event, and being in contact over social media. And while we're talking, if anyone has any other thoughts or ideas about a boundary extension that's not here, these are like four of kind of the big four, but there certainly can be many others.
Gretchen is
So
saying
self-disclosure.
Michael, I'm so sorry, but I can't resist
Okay.
sharing. I can't resist sharing Gretchen's comment because it's responding exactly to your question. Is that part of the requirement of her job was that you would drive clients and take them on outings, right?
Right.
Right. And so there you are in the car together, and it seemed as if you could chat away with them about anything and everything, but still, although you still have to, even in that context, figure out how to define the boundaries of what there is to speak about. And that's not easy.
And the more you're part of somebody's life in that way, it's in some ways a very different, but and also I'll say even a bigger challenge than maybe a therapist who's only seeing the person in a very controlled context. So the boundary issues can be really different. So again, in the chat, what kinds of things fall into what you might be in self-disclose either on purpose or by accident?
I can just say that in another job, I learned to take photos of my family off the wall because it wasn't fair to have them there and not be willing to answer questions about who they were, how old they were, what, whether my children were.
Right. So the kinds of things I'm talking about here are, your marital status, your dating status, whether you, as Patti just said, whether you have history. It's a decision if you're, a person with lived experience and you don't identify at work as a peer, whether you want to disclose that or not, your religion, your country of origin, all the way down to, even mundane things that, that are kind of personal decisions, like your favorite food or whatever. It can be anything. Now, sometimes there are acceptable reasons to disclose information about yourself. And you need to understand what your motive is in doing it. So, for example, you may want to normalize a client's behavior by sharing something from your own life that, you're comfortable sharing, that shows them that, that, as Patti kind of said, is that, not everyone's a rock star all the time. And also to, sometimes it is helpful to establish rapport. The issue of motive can be, and actually I'm going to go down, to understand your own life context and the role and your experience. If when I was having, my wife and I were having children, if, you're, as a man, and my wife's pregnant and having children, it's my choice to disclose whether, I've had a child. Women don't have that option. People, and so if I'm going to tell a client, oh, it just had, my wife and I just had a baby, I should understand what my motive is for doing it. I don't necessarily, I may want to, but I would need to understand, why am I sharing this? Why, what is going on in my life? And the other thing that Patti mentioned before that I think is really important, you have to be transparent. There are times when you may share something, you may talk about something and do something that, and we blow it. We make mistakes. It's only human, and it's so important. Two things are really important. One is that you seek supervision, you talk with your supervisor, and also that you document it. It needs to be really clear, because if there is a reaction and so on by the client, it needs to be in a context. It needs to be clear. There are times, again, when you accept gifts and attend life cycle events. The question again, if you accept a gift, what meaning does that gift have? And does accepting the gift cause the client harm? The other side is also true. Is not accepting the gift causing client harm? If it's part of a client's tradition in life to bring you something homemade for Christmas, do you turn that down? And this is one where we talked in the beginning about agency rules, agency rules about not accepting gifts and so on. This is one which, every holiday season and so on, I think comes up in every agency about, things. You don't want to be accepting a gift for, the fact that you've done your job. But there are things where, a gift is an expression of something. It might be, especially, again, in the course of the relationship, at termination, if a client gives you something as a thank you and so on. Where does that fall in? I'm not going to give you a hard and fast rule about it, but these are the kinds of things that we talk about. We talk about, what the gift symbolizes. There are religious ceremonies. If a client invites you to a baptism, and they invite you to, a wedding or funeral, what do you do? What do you decide? What will do it? The questions come up. If you're there and somebody asks you, how do you know Michael? What are you going to say? If Michael has to introduce Patti, because I've invited Patti to this event, am I prepared? How am I going to introduce Patti? Am I going to introduce her as a friend, as a long lost relative? How am I going to explain it? And again, and graduations and other things. And again, I'll share just kind of a personal experience and so on. For many years, I was the vice president of, called then, MICA residences that did therapeutic communities, and we also had a day treatment program. And once a year, we did a big graduation and we invited people's families and so on. And it was a really huge event. I would bring my children, my younger children, to that event. Because for me, it was something, it was a family experience. And I kind of wanted my children to have that, kind of see that experience. And also, I think on a selfish thing, to see kind of what Dad did. Dad worked with people, and the people had wonderful lives, and they heard people's stories of recovery and success, and how they, kind of moved on in their lives. And that was a decision. We talked about it with my supervisor at that time, but I thought that that was kind of important. So again, boundaries are not always that clear. We can have a long discussion, and watching the time, we're going to have a long discussion about how culture influences all these, issues and so on. I want to bring up also the notion that the workers' culture is also a factor. And not only workers' culture, your own personal preference is also often a factor in making decisions about what happens if, again, what happens if you're from a religious tradition where you don't have physical contact with somebody from the opposite sex that's not a relation? What if you practice halal and someone brings you pernil, which is, for those who don't know, pork, around Christmas, which is, kind of a wonderful gift to get, but you're not going to eat it, and you're going to, you may be telling the person in an honest way why you need to refuse this gift, and so on. It might also, again, be personal preference. You may decide that it's just for you, that, this is not something that you want to share or accept. You're not a hugger. In certain places, in certain programs and so on, it's okay to have hugs and personal, contact. In some places it's not. But you may have your own boundary around that, and that's okay. You don't have to give yourself up here. So here I just want to kind of get to that the important things here is that you educate yourself, that you kind of make it your business to be culturally literate, that you seek consultation and support from a supervisor, from a colleague. I know that I have sometimes called a priest or a rabbi. I've spoken to imams to try to understand a tradition. And the important thing is that you adopt a sense of humility and humbleness, that you're curious, that you find out from clients what's meaningful, and that you're open to not only sharing your own preferences, but also when you make a mistake. So I see there are a couple of things in the chat, but Patti, if there's anything you want to share. We'll move on to social media.
Yes, people are, this idea of how different cultures express gratitude is very profound, is really, really profound, and it can be so different, right? And understanding it, sometimes understanding it just so you can pick up on that's what's happening, is so important. And we have Stephen telling us that as an Ethiopagan, he gets a lot of cultural and religious stuff thrown at him. And, he just smiles and says, thank you. And, it's hard to know when he's pressed. When he doesn't return their blessings or religious greetings, it's hard to know how to respond. There's something about curiosity that others express that sometimes doesn't even feel that respectful. It's almost like being a voyeur, and it's hard to know how to respond. It's hard to know how much to tell somebody about who you are and what your beliefs are. Right.
Again, I'm remembering when I once gave my assistant a holiday gift, and she let me know that in her religious tradition she didn't celebrate Christmas, and that it was really something that she couldn't accept. And we had a conversation about it, and I gave her the gift later on, same thing, as an expression of appreciation for the work she did. So it was different. So things can be very different, and you just have to be open. So around social media, I had really liked this cartoon. I think here the important thing is, what you put out there, it isn't private. And the importance of setting up to the extent you can, setting up your privacy settings so that you maintain your work life and from your personal life. People can tag you, they can repost you. I mean, there's lots of stuff. I'm not on social media a lot, but and just for those of you that are, you have to be kind of really careful. And there are some kind of rules here. First one is don't assume. And don't accept. Again, this might say don't accept friend requests. And again, we can get into lots of issues again around how that may differ if you're in a peer role and so on. But by and large, this is the rule. Doing your privacy settings. And here's one that I'd like people to think about. And that is the other way around. And that is there ever a time when it's okay to look at a client's social media? And what are the privacy issues that go in that direction? And I'll move on, but Patti, if things come in, I'd be interested in the chat.
Yes. You can count on me to share.
Yeah, but because, again, we can get into issues of safety and so on, but when is it okay to do that? So what are the risks of unprofessional boundaries? Can abuse, neglect, mistreat people in care, do damage to the therapeutic relationship, can re-traumatize people. Again, Patti, we can remove an opportunity for the client to learn healthy boundaries, and people who have been, again, as we've talked about, subject to trauma may not know what healthy boundaries are. And there's role confusion between personal and professional. And Michael, also sometimes, yeah.
I was just going to say, James agrees that social media may be one of those places where, there just is a rule that there are no overlapping, as he so nicely puts it, social media.
Right. Yeah.
That it's a firm boundary.
I think if you're going to err in the side of caution, and so these are all, the possibilities that we can have. And then also one of the risks is legal consequences for staff. Now, there are times when clients will initiate or invite a boundary crossing or extension. When clients, are unclear. And we're going to move a little bit quickly here. But these are some of the times, when factors, and people again can comment in the chat, when clients may kind of do that. And I was thinking of something when I was looking this over in the morning, that there's another one. It can also go in the other direction of clients and families having rigid boundaries. Because I remember when I've done family therapy, and again, working in certain cultural contexts where shame and honor are really primary values. And there were so many family secrets that created a boundary between the the family system and me, in terms of trying to intervene in what was going on in the family. And it was just another example of that boundaries can both be kind of fluid and rigid. And I just want to kind of here, again, get into, be reflective. Does it enhance or threaten the client's safety? Is it meeting my needs of the clients? If I enter into a dual relationship, and have I considered the consequences? And does the client understand? Now, shifting a little bit from the rules-based to something that is more in terms of the continuum of behavior. We can really, at times, get into situations where we are either under-involved with a client and we're setting up a rigid boundary in that way, or we're over-involved. And what I want to say is that all of us can fall into these things sometimes. That, the extremes are bad, but, again, I know in my own career, when I've gotten under-involved, it's usually because I'm burned out. I have given so much of myself at that time that, I've checked out a little bit. And I need help from my supervisor and my team to pull me back. I need to do self-care. I need to kind of do it. And, that feeling here, being relieved when a client misses an appointment rather than to be concerned about it. When you find yourself really daydreaming, when you're not really, documenting, when you blaming clients for their problems, those are all kind of signs and symptoms. The other side of that is when you kind of get overly permissive, when you show favoritism. I don't know, anybody who hasn't at some point, because you end up kind of, look, we're only human. There's some people we tend to like more and relate to more in a situation, and we fall into favoritism, and we need our colleagues and our friends to help us, help us remember those boundaries. But these are things that, we include in talking about boundaries around privacy and so on, that are just really important.
Michael, Falguni has shared something that is so real, which is boundaries. When we establish professional boundaries, that are all about the kinds of things we have to do to really be to be helpful to our clients as professionals. It can feel like rejection.
Yes.
That there's been so much lack of support earlier in their lives, that very often when you say, the appointment is up now, because there are limits to the amount of time you can spend, for example, it feels hurtful. Clients take it personally and feels hurtful, because they're just extending the expectation that this is another source of lack of support. And it can be very hard. It can take a long time for people to understand that the boundaries you're establishing is because of how important it is to you that you really want to help them. And that the clarity yourself about who you are as a professional and how, what a big difference you can make using your professional toolkit.
Right.
Can make it much easier to stay within the bounds without feeling as though the client is right. It's a form of deprivation.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. So you can kind of look at this, you'll get the slides, but these are all kind of the good things. And again, the one here that I want to emphasize is communicating and documenting clearly and in a timely way. Patti talked about this before. I know there are supervisors on this. The most important things here is supervisors have to establish an atmosphere of transparency, where it's okay for staff to bring their mistakes. We all learn from our mistakes. We don't tend to learn from what we do well. We learn from what we struggle with. And so an atmosphere of openness is really important. You don't want, and that's also, it's a boundary issue. You don't want somebody creating a wall where they're hiding their work from you. That's really when things go bad. We can make mistakes, we can fix them, but usually it really becomes toxic in a supervisor relationship and treatment relationships if there's not an atmosphere of openness. The other thing, and again here it says about modeling clear boundaries for your staff, and also, caseloads are different. There are clients who really test boundaries more than others. And sometimes if you have a new worker coming in who doesn't know about, this client is going to be testing your boundaries, it's really important for the supervisor to prepare staff, to spend more time with staff on helping them deal with more difficult clients in terms of boundaries. And also, again, to be really aware of your staff's blind spots. We all got them. It is what makes us human. And for a supervisor to kind of really be helpful and understanding is so critical. I'm not going to do this poll. I'm going to skip this poll. I'm going to assume a lot of you are doing telehealth. And I just want to get into some specific things around telehealth. And again, around boundaries that really support the issues that are really important in terms of setting telehealth boundaries. One, it's really important, know what you're doing. If you're having trouble, you can't be focused on what's going on. From that respect, again, you can kind of be open about your struggles with the client, but they really are looking for you to have your act together around the technology, that this goes smoothly and that it doesn't interfere to the extent that you can avoid it with what happens in the session. Don't be late. It's as important, if not more important, to be on time for a telehealth session. If anything, you should try to get on about 5 minutes, test the equipment, be ready when the client comes on, not keep them waiting. Really important to keep to session times on this. One of the things I hear people talking about is that telehealth, because it's kind of at home and so on, there's a little drift. It sucks up your workday. You kind of, things bleed one into another. It's really important to know about the client's environment, to talk with them, to make sure to help the client know that they should be in a place where they can have a private conversation with you, where there's nobody who's listening in, where, to the extent, again, that somebody can be taking care of their kids during this, that you in the background can't see things that they don't want you to see in their background. that they have a right to control that part of privacy and they may not be aware of everything. And the same for you. I think we've all had experiences where it's really cute when our kids, kind of get into our Zoom session and so on, but that may not be what you want to have happen in your session. It might be fun on a staff meeting, but when you're working with someone, that may not be what you want to have. And also to be conscious, again, as Patti was mentioning, about pictures on the wall and so on, what's in your background that you want to make sure that you've kept private. This is just, again, kind of a graphic display of that. And I want to make sure that we get to this. Research has shown, and it's really important, that boundary violations tend to happen when staff are fatigued, burned out, and so on, when our needs for comfort and support are so overwhelming that we, kind of go looking for things and support in the wrong places, and we're not even conscious of it necessarily. And so the idea of self-care is so important. And the other side is we might create really rigid boundaries and to protect ourselves. To introduce the idea of emotional resonance. When we witness somebody in pain, the pain centers in our brains kind of become active. And it's referred to as emotional resonance. And it's the basis, it's what empathy and compassion are based on. And all of you who are in the field, who are caring and so on, you and your client, and this is one of the paradoxes of the work we do, and what we're talking about today, is that underneath this discussion of barriers is the need to make connection for the client and for us. That's how we do our work, is through connectedness. And connectedness can take a toll through vicarious trauma and just for our empathy. And that's what makes all the discussion, all the workshops on self-care, making time and so on, so critical. And to avoid this, and that's what all of this has to do with boundaries, is that we tend to, if we're burned out, we've done this is where boundaries kind of get troubled. This is kind of important. This is kind of what I've mentioned. I don't know how many of you can relate to the guy in bed looking at his email. I can. Again, so important. And this may be something, a discussion with your supervisor, that there is a work day. And again, in this era of COVID and so on and Zoom, sometimes that gets lost. So I want to do a really brief meditation before we get off there, just kind of feel this. So I will ask people, if they can, again, to kind of get into a comfortable position and close your eyes. Center your body. Feel yourself there. And if you want this time, put a hand on your heart. Feel yourself. Make a physical connection between you and your heart. If you feel tension in another part of your body and you feel comfortable moving your hand to that part to hold it, maybe your stomach and so on, you can put your hand there too. The idea is to bring warmth to yourself and just kind of focus for a minute or so on your breathing. You don't have to control your breath, just focus on your natural breath. And I'd like you to think about a particular situation or a person that you kind of may be struggling with. And I want you to repeat these phrases either softly or just in your mind. I'm having a hard time right now. Everyone feels this way sometime. May I be kind to myself in this moment. May I give myself the compassion I need. Once more. I am having a hard time right now. Everyone feels this way sometime. May I be kind to myself in this moment. May I give myself the compassion I need. Take a few breaths while you let those words sink in a little bit. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes. Anybody has any thoughts or reactions to that meditation? I'd appreciate, it'd be great if you put them in the chat.
Michael, you're
Yeah.
getting thanks for that lovely meditation because it provided a sense of relief.
Okay, so I just want to be sensitive to people's time. So I'm going to jump in now and let you all know. First of all, thank you, Michael and Patti, for that wonderful presentation. We have put the link to the CBC website in the chat box so that so if you scroll up, I know a lot of people are saying thank you right now. If you scroll up, you can get that link, and that is where, oh, thank you. That's where the slides will be and the recording will be. We also have a survey, an evaluation of the training. If you wouldn't mind clicking on that link, the Qualtrics link, you can fill out the survey. It will also, when you close out of the webinar, it should pop up as well. So thank you so much. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. And thank you again to Patti and Michael.
Thank you.
Thanks,
everybody. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate your attention.
Nice.
Give you a call, Patti.
Okay.